following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. Hello, listeners around the world on radio, streaming, and podcast services. This is It's Not Therapy. I'm Liana Kersner, and I am not a therapist, but I am your source for navigating the madness of mental health using my top 10 sayings for going good crazy. This week, we're going to talk about forgiveness and concepts related to forgiveness, like closure and reconciliation. And there's gonna be a focus on why you don't have to forgive and how forced forgiveness is bad. A guest is returning to It's Not Therapy for this episode. Amanda Ann Gregory, licensed clinical professional counselor, is back to talk to us because she has a book out. You Don't Need to Forgive: Trauma Recovery on Your Own Terms is the name of the book. I'm gonna keep this opening short because I want to get right to Amanda and then save time at the end of the show for a wrap up, because real talk, I have issues with how performative so-called forgiveness tends to be. I truly believe that holding grudges leads to some utterly stupid decisions and some really bad behavior. But I've also seen firsthand evidence that trying to force oneself or others to forgive also leads to some utterly stupid decisions and some really bad behavior. Top 10 phrase: don't let problems that aren't your fault lead to mistakes that are. A lot of families have at least one person who consistently causes trouble, and the other family members are supposed to forgive them due to some platitude like, he's your brother, she can't help it, they're doing their best. Personally, I don't think that benefits anyone, including the person getting the easy ride. It's one thing to try to persuade someone to give a person another chance, with the understanding that you may fail to persuade, and that's okay. It's another thing entirely to demand someone forgives or attempt to coerce them into capitulating. And that's what forced forgiveness really is to me, personally. Just like I've said in previous weeks, a weaponized boundary is not a boundary. It's just a Starbucks cup with boundary written on it spelled wrong. Yeah. A capitulation is what a forced forgiveness actually is. And capitulations are terrible for trauma survivors who, like me, needed major help learning to set and enforce boundaries. Capitulations are usually part of the trauma that we're in recovery for. So continued capitulations are counter to recovery. There's this thing about, recovering from trauma that you matter. And what you want matters, and what feels good matters, and what feels bad matters. That's what makes you you. You can't have people stomping all over you. To be clear, a compromise is not a capitulation. A compromise is a negotiation wherein all parties involved get at least something they want. And it's strange to me how many adults don't understand this concept, but I think it has something to do with the fact that most people agree fairness is important. Fairness is a big value, but far fewer people are willing to put in the investment of time, effort, and emotion to make sure things are actually fair. And fair means fair for everyone. Same set of rules for everybody. That's a lot harder than just stomping your feet and saying, that's not fair. I watched the movie Labyrinth over the weekend. This is a major part of it. No kidding. Amazing movie. Watch it. Anyway, before that, I was on the receiving end of an absolutely spectacular theatrical non-apology that actually became relevant to this show, even though I booked the interview before this happened, okay? This person, it was, I'm still unpacking this, because they insisted that what they'd done was inexcusable. I believe the word they used was atrocity. And they said that apologies didn't cut it anymore. You might not be surprised that they never actually apologized in the first place. Now, the other strange thing about this whole exchange was that nothing they said was horrible, terrible, no good sounded all that terrible to me. They were actually sort of understandable. Problem is, they also weren't the things I'd asked them to stop doing. So the performance with the combination of not dealing with the things I told them was a problem and turning into big problems, things that didn't really sound like problems to me. They sounded like understandable humaning. It left me thinking like, all right, there's a lot of emotion here and it's not lining up with what you're saying. What did you actually do that you're not telling me? You ever been in that sort of situation? Right? The only clear statement that I managed to extract from this whole thing was when this person said, I am not asking for forgiveness. And the reason it stood out was, though it was clear, it was really confusing. Because, okay, statement A, they'd done something horrible, atrocious, right? Statement B, apologies don't cut it anymore. Statement 3, I'm not asking for forgiveness. Okay, with those 3 things, what's the purpose of the entire conversation, right? And while preparing for this show, I've come to 2 conclusions. 1, indeed, the person wasn't asking for forgiveness. I think they just didn't want to put the effort in to maintain the relationship anymore for whatever reason, right? Just blow things up because melting down is easy and working things out is hard and scary. And all right, no problem. I can live with that. 2, we weren't coming at the conversation working from the same definition of forgiveness. To me, forgiveness is the point where something from the past doesn't hurt me anymore. I don't feel angry about it. Or, maybe it's a little bit like it hurts a little, but it's in its proper place. Like it's in a healthy place. Same thing, little bits of anger, not, every time I think of it, just rah. Like it gets to a place that feels right. I don't resent or hate the person for what went down anymore. So maybe you can see how going into a conversation and someone says, I'm not asking for forgiveness. Based on my definition of forgiveness, this is the person saying, I want you to hate me forever. Which I don't think is what the person meant. And honestly, I can't rule it out, but I don't know, right? And part of this is the defining forgiveness is confusing. Okay, respected psychological sources refer to forgiveness as a deliberate act. And I don't find that to be so. I can't just make myself forgive someone. Now, granted, I have extremely little experience being the recipient of real forgiveness. I have much more experience with people holding grudges, never really letting it go, and taking it out on me whenever they feel like it going forward. Making a mistake or being blamed for something meant I was branded by that thing for life. And I had to accept that I'd ruined things for the people around me. It was never going to go away, and I couldn't fix it. I just had to accept that I was annoying, bad, and in the way. That, sadly, is not an exaggeration. Some of them claim to forgive me, but then they bring the thing up again. It was this thing of always in the background, always whenever I wanted something or something was important to me, it was that you're doing it again face, you're ruining everything again. Not said, it was just that tension, right? And if I'm forgiven, why is that happening? And of course, if there's a lingering hurt that I wanted to talk about, I just got, when are you going to let that go? And that made me feel extremely guilty, like I was doing something wrong for not just being able to let it go. And I know this is a really common struggle. It took me years of work to learn that closure and forgiveness don't work that way. You can't just let it go. I mean, even in Frozen, she sings about let it go. And she just spends years of isolation alone in her ice. How is that letting it go? You're isolating yourself from the world, Elsa. What are you letting go? No, that's avoidant behavior. I'm totally derailing this back on track, okay? For me, forgiveness is a pleasant side effect of closure. Closure is something I know how to work toward, okay? I can consciously say I'm done with this. I can close the door. I won't go back. I can recognize it's bad for me. Doesn't mean I'm not going to be tempted, but that I can make myself do. Top 10 phrase, healthy goals are based on things you can control, right? So if I get away from the situation that's triggering all these alarm bells, right? If I get that, if I get closure, if I can feel safe, then I can say, okay, that was a bad situation. Bad stuff went down, but they're not bad people, right? Doesn't mean I'm ever speaking to them again, but I don't think they're bad people. They're probably good people. We're just not the same kind of good, right? We're better apart than together. Sometimes. I have a very high bar for truly considering someone a bad person. But there are people who do pass that bar. Sometimes they go way past that bar. And every single one of them has one thing in common. Not a single one of those people is capable of forgiving. They just can't do it, right? You talk to these people, they can tell you in detail some slight from 20 years ago. It might not even accurately be what happened, but they are still clearly bent out of shape. So somebody does something to them when they were 15. It's still fresh, right? And someone can say, that's trauma. And it's like, yeah, it probably is trauma, but something can be trauma and a grudge. And that's when the bad decisions happen, right? Some people have constructed their entire adult lives trying to repudiate or get back at the people who hurt them in their past. And those people are carrying around an unhealthy amount of chronic rage. And it leads to them doing some really awful stuff. True forgiveness stops you from becoming like that. But that's just my frame. I am not an expert on this. Let's bring on someone who is. Amanda Ann Gregory, author of the new book, You Don't Have to Forgive, Trauma Recovery on Your Own Terms, will join us after the break. Do you have a story you think would be good for the show? Are you interested in sponsoring the show? Liana at nottherapyshow.com. Nottherapyshow.com is the website. At nottherapyshow on socials. That went longer than I thought. Back from the break after this with Amanda Ann Gregory on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back in It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist. We are still talking about forgiveness. Do you need to? And the lady of the hour is here right now. Returning guest Amanda Ann Gregory is back on It's Not Therapy. And the book, Amanda, is finally out. You Don't Need to Forgive, Trauma Recovery on Your Own Terms. Amanda is I am going to mess this up, licensed clinical professional counselor. Amanda, welcome back to It's Not Therapy.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh my gosh. 5 years, 3 years researching it, 2 years writing it. It's finally out.
Yeah. Writing a book is a lot of work. So tell us about the book. You talked about some of these concepts when you were here last, but this is a deep dive into force, pressured, even encouraging forgiveness can cause harm and like re-traumatization, correct?
Right. And I think that the encouraging part is going to throw some people off.
Uh-huh.
Because when I talk to other clinicians about the book, most of them will agree that pressuring, forcing people to forgive, that is not going to work. That is not going to benefit them, and in fact, that could harm them. But when I go a step further and I talk about, well, maybe we shouldn't even encourage forgiveness, then they're like, oh, well, that's kind of an interesting take. And if I could sum up the book, it's pretty much about, it's not an anti-forgiveness book. And I know some people are going to think it is just because of the title, you don't need to forgive, but you don't need to forgive. It doesn't mean that, maybe forgiveness wouldn't benefit you. And really what the book is saying is that we should all be proponents of elective forgiveness, which means that if you want to forgive, great. If you feel like you need to forgive, great. If it'll benefit you, wonderful. But there is no significant evidence that says that, especially for trauma survivors, we need to forgive to recover from trauma. It's just not there.
Yeah, I've found in my own background, my own story, that when I tried to forgive, I got angrier and I felt more helpless. And the blame and shame spiral kicked in. The problem's me. I just can't forgive. I'm a bad person. All that stuff. When I just sort of did the work, the other work, right? The working through it, making it make sense, moving past that stuck point. Forgiveness was almost a byproduct of the other stuff instead of an end in itself, right?
Right. And sometimes forgiveness just happens.
Yeah.
I discover a lot in my work with trauma survivors, but also in the research, that there is very much this experience of, I call it organic forgiveness, where it's maybe I don't make this conscious choice to forgive. Maybe I'm not even seeking forgiveness. Perhaps I'm even just against forgiveness. And then I do the work, and then all of a sudden I forgive. And I'm the one that's more surprised than anybody.
Yeah, you hear stories about that, and people who forgive, their children's killer, or, the other side of a war, they're really put up on pedestals by society. But if you actually talk to them about their process, they say, they were angry in a lot of time for a really long time. They wanted this vengeance. They wanted the fairness to be restored. And I think that has to fall into place first before you can, like you said, either choose to forgive. But I think you're right that it is just something that happens and you don't realize it's happened until one day you go, hey, I'm not carrying this around anymore. Right?
Yeah, and I tell people, that if people who want to forgive are struggling, I say, look, kind of like some of the things you've already said, there may be some things that you need to address first. And I've noticed that there are some things that have to come before forgiveness, or really need to be addressed because they're obstacles. So for example, safety is one. We have to feel safe enough to forgive, especially if that person or situation still has access to us, can cause us harm. There needs to be safety first. You mentioned shame. That's a big one. Shame is a huge obstacle in forgiveness. And so instead of, well, I just need to overcome that and forgive, well, how about we address the shame? How about we work on that before? And then anger is another one. We have to go through that emotional processing. I tell people that if there was a shortcut around that, I tell you what it is. I would, but there's just not. And forgiveness absolutely isn't the shortcut or the way around emotional processing. We have to feel the anger. And I know a lot of folks are afraid of that. I think Audre Lorde said it the best. We're afraid of our own anger. We're afraid of other people's anger, particularly the anger of women. But if we don't, and remember, anger doesn't mean vengeance. Anger doesn't mean actions. Anger is an emotion.
Yep.
If we don't allow it to be here, if we don't really embrace it with some compassion and empathy, and try to stifle it down with forgiveness, which probably isn't going to be genuine, then we're kind of hindering ourselves in our own healing process.
All the focus, all the pressure ends up on the person who was allegedly wronged instead of it being the person who did the wronging. What's going on here?
There's a lot of things
Yeah.
going on here. I think if we look at just the impact of overall society, on forgiveness, there is unfortunately this myth
Yeah.
that has been bought and sold of forgiveness as this almost this moral virtue that if you're a good person, you forgive. If you're not a good person, well, then you don't. And the world isn't black and white like that, but unfortunately, that's what's been sold. But also, I think forgiveness as a panacea,
Yeah.
just it's going to make you feel better. It's going to cure your trauma. It's going to do all these things. Like, there's nothing, especially nothing in the realm of psychology, that is a panacea. There's nothing. There's no intervention. There's no pill.
Right.
There's nothing that's a panacea. But when we talk about families, and I mentioned this in my book because it's so important, is there's another layer of influence, and it could be of culture, it could be unique to the family unit. But again, with society, we do sometimes have this belief of what I call, this genetic relational entitlement. And
Nice.
yeah, so like if you have the same or similar genetic makeup of someone, then they get a pass. You need to forgive them. You need to view them differently. But what if that relationship isn't entitled to anybody?
Right.
Then what? Then, does that change the dynamic? One thing that I like to say to people, which I think is so interesting, is that when people bring up forgiveness in family relationships, sometimes they go back to the Bible, they go back to quotes, and they'll say things as, blood is thicker than water. We've heard that for years. We hear it all the time. But actually, there are some scholars that even disputed what it means.
Yep.
They said that it does not mean that, their family members, your genetic relations, are stronger than your friends. It actually means the opposite.
Yep.
That, the blood that we shed on the battlefield with our peers, we have a stronger connection to them than the water of the womb, which is family. So the actual quote could have been misused
Yep.
for different purposes.
I want to go right back to what you said about safety,
Mm-hmm.
right? A lot of people grow up in families, like families of origin, that are not safe. They're codependencies. And that whole you have to forgive, you should forgive, God wants you to forgive. That becomes a safety issue because let's face it, the family there is not demanding forgiveness. The family is demanding that status quo returns. Everybody goes back to talking to each other and nothing changes, right?
They want to continue the dysfunctional family dynamic.
Yeah.
Yes, that
Yeah.
that does tend to be what it is. And when family members come to me and say, "Well, I need them to forgive. They should forgive." One thing I like to bring up to them is, "What does that mean?
Yeah.
Forgiveness. What does that mean to you?" And I sometimes I say this. I say, "Okay, what if they do forgive? They genuinely forgive, but
Hmm.
they decide not to have a relationship or any interactions with that person or the entire family going forward. Is that okay?" And usually the response is no, that's not forgiveness.
That's right.
But it is forgiveness. They're talking about reconciliation.
Right. That's the word I was looking for. Yeah. And they're not the same thing.
No, they're not. And the thing with reconciliation is we absolutely need to have a sense of safety to reconcile. There does need to be some changes from the offender. And
Yeah.
and forgiveness doesn't require that. But reconciliation or having some type of a relationship with those boundaries does. And
Yes.
I have found people that they confuse forgiveness and reconciliation all the time.
It's true to the point that you probably don't know anything about this, but there was this huge explosion from a scene in a video game where it was a game called Dragon Age the Veilguard. It was a wonderful scene about true penance, true apologies require some sort of action. It's not enough to say, I'm sorry. In fact, sometimes somebody can be so sorry that they're trying to dodge responsibility. What they were saying is, unless there is action, unless there is change, it's really hard to feel like it's sincere. And when I played through this, I'm like, this is amazing. Other people interpreted that exact same scene as, oh, you have to endure punishment for the person to forgive you. Do you have any idea what's going on in these two very different frames about the exact same, to me, I think perfectly good concept that apology without change is kind of pointless?
Yeah, and sometimes even an apology is not even necessary,
Yes, that's true.
for forgiveness. And I think really if we kind of look at that video game and those responses, I kind of wonder, sometimes we will empathize with the person who was harmed. Sometimes we may empathize with the offender.
Right.
And so if I'm an offender and I harm someone and I don't really take accountability for that, or I don't have that insight, or I don't feel that sting that I feel in my bones from harming them, and I don't
Right.
feel that guilt. And what we're looking for is guilt, not shame. So if I don't feel that, and then someone is not forgiving me or doesn't want to reconcile with me or needs me to change, I might feel like I'm being punished.
Yes. In the
Right.
terminology, I think
Yeah.
we're both using it. Like guilt
Mm-hmm.
is productive because it goes, I don't want to feel this anyway anymore. I'm not going to do this anymore. Whereas shame, you're just stuck in it.
Yeah, and an easy way to separate the two, and I do this with my clients and other clinicians, and I say, take your finger and point it at your chest, point at yourself. That's
Mm-hmm.
shame. Shame is always about you. Shame is always about who you are. So I may have done that thing, but I did that because I'm a bad, I'm unlovable. I'm not good
Right.
enough. Guilt, point your finger away. That's something you did or didn't do that doesn't line up with who you are. That's guilt. And guilt can prevent you from doing that thing again.
Right.
But shame does not. That's why we've really moved away from shame-based parenting, because we found that these kids will actually do the behaviors again because they're like, well, yeah, I'm a bad kid, and that's what
Yeah.
bad kids do.
Yeah. Yeah. This is an overall thing in society right now where we like to label good people and bad people
Mm-hmm.
instead of good actions, bad actions, or even not put a moral charge on the action, just recognize the negative consequence.
Well, yeah, and I think that's because we don't give space
Yeah.
to the process of forgiving and processing. And I think honestly, one of the biggest things is I had to write a whole chapter about what is forgiveness and what is it not.
Hmm.
And and I hate it that I had to do that, but I had to do that because we're not defining it the same way. Sometimes we define it as black and white.
Hmm.
And honestly, in the field of psychology, we do not have an agreed upon definition of forgiveness. So I want everyone to hear that, because when there is a clinician or a psychologist or a researcher saying you need to forgive, what are they talking about? Because they're not talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
Is forgiveness this emotional change towards the other person? Some people will say that you have to get to the point of love. You have to get
Yeah.
there. And if not, you haven't forgive, you have failed. You're bad at forgiving. But other people say, well, no, it's just, you just like them. You don't have to love them. Other people will say, well, no, it's kind of apathy. You can get to an apathetic point where
Right.
it's maybe I don't wish them well, but I don't wish them harm and I don't really care. And a lot of people say, well, that's forgiveness.
Right.
So we're kind of all over the board here in just
Yeah.
in psychology. And so I don't expect other people to know what forgiveness is either.
Let's go to a break and come back to talk about that because I do think this is a big part of processing. Terminologies get in people's way.
Yes.
So, Amanda Ann Gregory, author of You Don't Need to Forgive, excuse me, You Don't Need to Forgive, Trauma Recovery on Your Own Terms. Amanda is a licensed clinical professional counselor. She's been on the program before talking about trauma. We're here talking about forgiveness now. Nice little bookend, but we will be back more with Amanda after the break. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back and It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist. We are talking to the wonderful and brilliant, or should I say wise, Amanda Ann Gregory, author of You Don't Need to Forgive, Trauma Recovery on Your Own Terms, and returning guest to It's Not Therapy. And before the break, Amanda touched on something amazing in that there are not agreed upon definitions for a lot of the terms we use in the mental health space. And forgiveness is one, processing is another. And I have clients, mainly autistic clients, who we spend weeks figuring out, what do these things mean? and they get very frustrated that they will ask for people and get five different answers.
Mm-hmm.
How do you even begin to understand these terms enough to practice them when we exist in this sea of ish?
I always tell people that bring them into the context of the relationship.
Okay.
Don't worry so much about the black and white definitions because, the DSM is significantly flawed. I work with I specialize in complex trauma recovery. This
Mm-hmm.
is something that does not have a diagnosis. It
Yep.
doesn't. It's not PTSD. It's complex trauma, developmental trauma. So think of how weird that is that I've devoted my entire career to a population of people that according to the DSM don't exist.
Yep, I'm one of those people, and now we're getting into, yeah, we have to call it developmental trauma for a billing code. But
Yeah, like
yeah,
it's changing all the time. So when clinicians, when clients, when other people come to me just about this terms and this confusion, here's what I say. I was like, go to the relationship. So if you're in a therapeutic relationship with someone, how are they defining it? How are you defining it? Is
right.
there agreed upon definition? With my clients, I say, look, it doesn't matter that I can't diagnose you with, complex PTSD or developmental trauma. You have these symptoms. And that's what we're going to work on. We're going to work on your
Mm-hmm.
experience and what you need. I don't care what I call it at the end of the day. If someone is recommending that you forgive or they want you to forgive, what does it mean to them? What are they recommending? What does it
Mm-hmm.
mean to you? So it's more like a discussion. And when we get in these places where we ask someone, what does that word mean to you? What does forgiveness mean? What does trauma mean? What does gaslighting mean? Right? What does
Right.
codependency mean to you? And they don't know. Then we can say, okay, I would really appreciate it if you wouldn't use that word or wouldn't recommend that to me because you don't know what it means or you don't have,
Right.
your own definition. This is what it means to me. So I think that is the easiest. Now, can we go and look at some of these official definitions? Absolutely.
Yep.
We can. And I know as therapists, yes, we do have some definitions of these and we use these, but when it comes down to the boots on the floor, like doing the work in therapy, I'm going to use those words in a way that benefits my client,
Right.
and what they're working on. And sometimes I don't have to use any of these words at all because they don't come into the mix. And so I always tell people go to the relationship, make it about those terms in the context of that to get better clarity.
The act of being able to define one's own experience for ourself, that in itself is a big part of healing, right?
It is.
That's a big part of regaining the control that you need to feel safe so that the warning bells stop flashing. You can come down from like DEFCON 3, or I say 3 because I always forget if 1 or 5 is the worst. But, you can come down from that state of panic and threat and actually do get to that process of, that person's got their own struggles and maybe I can't be around them, but I don't think they're rotten to the core. Uh,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah. So that safety is in place. And you know what? Sometimes people, as they, go through their own work and they end up forgiving,
yeah,
without, really seeking it. It just, it's kind of that organic forgiveness. It just happens. Sometimes they choose not to reconcile, not to have the person in their life, not because they believe the person is bad, or even not because they're afraid of the person anymore, but because the person doesn't add value to their life.
right,
And that is controversial for some people. They don't want to hear that,
right.
especially when it comes to family members, right? To say, oh, you don't want to have this family member in your life because they don't have value. That's selfish. Is it?
And this is why I feel bad that the whole concept of rational selfishness has been so demonized, right? Because there actually is a point there,
Mm-hmm.
in the airplane, put on your own mask before aiding other passengers thing. The subjectivity is very real.
Mm-hmm.
It makes it very difficult, especially when our super duper charged age right now. It gets very messy, right? What do you do with these complex things where people feel like, yes, they made mistakes, they were in the wrong, they have to forgive themselves, but maybe would like forgiveness from the other person, but also they feel wronged themselves. They need to both forgive and be forgiven at the same time.
Right. And so with somebody who might be in this situation and somebody who's definitely tried and maybe even utilized forgiveness as a way to manage the pain,
Mhm.
or they're not able to achieve forgiveness, even if they try, I would just take forgiveness off the table.
Yep.
I would say, hey, what if we're not saying you're not going to forgive? What if we just put forgiveness on the side for a second?
Right.
What if we actually allowed your brain and your body to
Hmm.
lead us where we need to go and we just follow every step of the way? So, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be embracing that emotional processing. We're going to see if we can access what's buried deep because we're just putting forgiveness aside. So, we don't need to work on forgiveness. Okay. That may come up naturally. We may go back to that. It's optional,
Right.
but we can go deep into those emotions. We may see, is there any shame there? We may look at, self-forgiveness. Self-forgiveness, I believe, is also elective. I don't believe
Yes.
we have to forgive ourselves, and this and that. And again, self-forgiveness can always be organic. There's a lot of different interventions for self-forgiveness, but I think with someone like this, who has been just wrapped up in all of this stuff and forgiveness hasn't been achievable or hasn't
Hmm.
worked, what if we just take it off the table, not saying it can't come back, but just take it off the table and focus on what's here.
That's really profound. Now, what happens with someone? Because you said self-forgiveness is elective.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you probably broke a lot of people's brains. I think I know what you mean here. So I'm going to see if I'm right. That's where sort of the process comes in, right? Like, okay, I can't forgive myself right now. What can I do to work on the guilt, work on the shame, right? What's within my control? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, but especially when it comes to trauma recovery,
Right.
what I have noticed is that with a lot of people, self forgiveness doesn't need to happen because in this process, some people can do what I call is an accurate assessment of your capability at the time.
Okay.
So sometimes when we're looking at what we did or didn't do to survive, we inaccurately assess that capability. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example I use in my book that is kind of dramatic, but I think it really speaks well to this concept. I work with a 16-year-old boy, and he
Mm-hmm.
experienced severe emotional, physical abuse and neglect from his mother. And it was
Mm-hmm.
about from ages 3 to 5. So very early
Ooh.
on, he
Right.
was removed from the home. I got him at 16. By the time I got him, he believed he was a completely bad kid.
Mm-hmm.
He was violent. He would lash out. He didn't have any relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And one belief that he was holding on to was the beliefs of, I should have protected myself.
Right.
I should have done a better job protecting my sister. I should have told someone, all these
Mm-hmm.
things. And he believed them. There was nothing you could have said.
Yep.
And so some people tried to work with him on self forgiveness. But instead, what I had him do one day is I had him draw a picture of himself at 5 years old. Now, this would have been the oldest he was when the abuse was taking place.
Right.
This 16-year-old drew a picture of a 16-year-old
Yep.
as a 5-year-old. I mean, this kid had abs. This 5-year-old had muscles.
Yeah.
He was tall. And then I had him draw a picture of a regular 5-year-old, like a 5-year-old he would see, maybe out and about. And he drew a little kid with a teddy bear.
Uh-huh.
And then I had him put them side by side.
Yeah.
And I think that was the first time he saw it and he felt it.
Because it was
And
real.
it was
Yeah.
real. And
Yeah.
it's so hard to admit that I couldn't have done anything
Yeah.
different. Right.
Yeah.
And some people might say, oh, that feels relieving. Well, yeah, in time, but that's a hard pill to swallow. So if we look at that example, that 16-year-old did not need self forgiveness because he didn't do anything wrong.
Right.
So sometimes in trauma recovery, that's where I go first. We need to do an accurate assessment of your capabilities because a lot of times we just sort of project who we are now onto that person. When I say capabilities, I also mean resources. Who did you have in your life at the time? What were your
Right.
finances like? Like, you have to consider all that. Now, if you come out of that and you're like, yeah, I still messed up, I hurt other people. Okay, we can look at that.
Right.
Let's embrace some guilt. What does it look at to embrace guilt instead of shame then? And Do you feel like you need to forgive yourself? We can absolutely go down that road, but do we need to?
Yeah, that's a really good point because that is something I found really changed my life. The concept of I didn't do anything wrong. I don't think I did anything wrong, and that matters. That I'd say it destroys relationships, but it was actually other people not being able to accept that. It was both ends, right? But it really does change the paradigm for you when you embrace the idea that there may be nothing to forgive in this case. What do you do when someone is pushing, right? You know, that really toxic, well, I said I'm sorry, and they're waiting for an I'm sorry too.
Mm-hmm.
This is
Yeah.
especially among women.
I think there's a ton of things we can unpack there. First of all, I would ask, were you really sorry? Because it's okay if you're not.
Right, exactly.
What if you're not sorry? And what if you don't say you're sorry? I mean, what does that feel like in your body to not apologize? For some people, particularly women, it feels unsafe
Yep.
to not apologize, or it feels like I'm not being, a good person. But what if you're not sorry? What if you don't feel that guilt? Okay. What if you just sit with that for a moment? And so it's kind of embracing that emotional honesty. And for some people that I've worked with, it's, well, that's just what I've always done. Oh,
Right.
okay. Yeah. So this is just a pattern, automatic response. What if you didn't have that anymore? What would that feel like if you just didn't say, I'm sorry? And maybe also exploring, what does it actually mean to feel sorry, to
Yeah.
feel bad, because you can communicate that you feel bad without ever apologizing. There are a lot of ways
Right.
to communicate that.
Right. One of the things I find myself doing more and more is what I did upset you, and I don't want that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I want to make sure that doesn't happen again. And I realize well, I'm not really sorry because I didn't know and I didn't do anything wrong, but it's just something I didn't know about that was a button for somebody else. But I don't want it to happen again, and I want to express that I care about them. And I think that's something, and I wonder if you agree that that sincere, those communications of, I care about you, I want you in my life, these are steps we skip in communication that I think would really be beneficial for other people to hear. But it's almost a vulnerability that we don't want to do. And so we get oh, I know he loves me, or they know I care about them. And that's an assumption that I think is damaging to relationships. What do you think?
Yeah, I think communicating that intention, of
Hmm.
what do you want in the relationship is really important because we can't expect that people know. I mean, how many times have we come across um, people whose maybe somebody has passed away and they will say things like, well, I hope they loved me, or I think they love me, but I'm not
Yeah.
sure. And I hope they're proud of me now. And I think if those people were here among us, usually they would say, why do they not know that I'm proud of them? Why do they not
Right.
know that I love them? It's like, well, I don't know. Did we say it enough? Did we somehow communicate it? So absolutely, I think sometimes expressing our intention in our relationships, especially if there's a rupture that occurs and we're repairing that rupture,
Right.
is really important because we just can't assume that people already know.
How do you handle it? This is the last question because we're out of time, but how do you handle it when someone has passed? And so that direct closure can't happen. And yet there is this unresolved, I don't know if they loved me. I don't know if they accepted me because some people will drive themselves absolutely insane with the uncertainty.
First of all, closure can happen. And I know that's odd to hear because they're gone, but closure can happen without the involvement of the other person. And this is especially important in trauma recovery because, perpetrators do die. And
Hmm.
people are like, well, I'm never going to get my closure. Well, yes, you can. There's
Yeah.
a lot of closure that we can get within ourselves. And so that closure could be forgiveness. That closure could be the me. And sometimes it's, especially if the question is, did they love me? Are they proud of me? It's really accessing that grief because that's kind of a sign of grief.
Yeah.
And we gotta grieve. Again, there's no shortcut. Forgiveness isn't a shortcut for grieving. It's just not. If anything, people who have forgiven went through that grieving process before they were able to get there. So I would encourage someone to really embrace that grieving. And a lot of times, deep down, we already know the answer. When all those intense emotions are not stifling it, we do. So for example, I dedicate my book to my grandma, Dorothy. She always wanted to write a book. She experienced a lot of trauma in her life and she never got a chance. I sort of wrote the book for her. And so there have been moments where I've had to pause and say, I wonder what my grandmother would think of me. I wanted this. And if I go really, really deep, like in my heart, in my body, I know she's proud of me.
Amanda Ann Gregory, You Don't Need to Forgive, Trauma Recovery on Your Own Terms. I'm saying the name of the book a lot because people are listening to this on the radio and I want them to remember it. Guys, if you're in your car right now and you forget, message me or send me something on social media, nottherapyshow.com, Liana at nottherapyshow.com, at Not Therapy on social media. If you're like, what was the name of that Amanda lady's book? I will tell you, it's You Don't Need to Forgive. Amanda, thanks so much for coming back on It's Not Therapy, sharing your insights. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much.
When we come back, a really quick wrap up. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back in It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist. We are still talking about forgiveness. You don't have to get closure and heal from trauma. And we have maybe a minute left in this show. I went long with Amanda because, she went so deep, and I love it when guests come on here. And just that was the message, is you do need to go deep. You do need to hear some things you don't want to hear. You do need to accept some things you don't want to accept, because nothing meaningful is both simple and easy. But it's really simple at its core. We just get in the way and complicate it and make a big mess. And I do think that when we strip all the complications away, it actually does become really clear. You can't forgive something you don't understand yet. And if you don't dig deep, if you're not figuring out what these emotions feel like, what's the experience of these emotions and what are they connected to, you can't get closure, you can't forgive, and you can't reconcile because, you haven't really connected to what's going on. And even the negative emotions, guilt, even exploring shame and moving away from it, those are connections and they're important, and time is also important. So your crazy is only a problem if it's hurting you. See you next time.